Welcome back. We are making our way through a good part of the course now, and you've been steeped now for a few weeks in the wonderful work of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and we're getting ready to conclude that work with the point of view assignment that you've already heard about in a previous video. And we're going to conclude Ovid's Metamorphoses with the real Roman aspect of it, with a retelling of the story of Aeneas, as you've already, of course, read extensively in Virgil's Aeneid. It is told in much briefer form in the latter parts of Ovid's Metamorphoses after the retelling of the Trojan War. And, of course, the work will run all the way down to the Roman Republic and finally the Roman Empire with the death of Julius Caesar and the uprising of Emperor Augustus. However, we're going to take a short break now and take a look for this week at a couple of other authors whose works show us a rather unusual form of literature for both Greeks and Romans, and that is satire, and satire also as interrelated with the long prose fiction form of literature, the novel. And we're going to use a different video in which to talk about the genres of satire and novel as shown to us with both Petronius and the other author discussed this week in a different video, Lucius Cornelius Seneca. But for right now, we're going to focus on Petronius, the little that we know about him and the work that we have surviving of him. And then we're going to spend the next video talking in somewhat longer detail about Seneca and his satiric work called the Apocalycantosis, the pumpkinification of Claudius. So we'll come back to Ovid again to conclude his Metamorphoses next week and also complete the point of view assignment. Okay, so let's now discuss Petronius. Please at this point pause your video. Please go to Sakai and pull out handout number 5 from resources. Please pause your video and pull out handout number 5. Okay, do you have that handout out? You're all set. Thank you. So now, Petronius, as you can see on the handout, has a full name of Petronius Arbiter. Now, arbiter is the Latin word for a judge, and it in fact is a word that has come into English referring to a referee or umpire or judge in some type of gaming competition. Now, Petronius Arbiter is the name that we know of for a politician in Roman times, and also appears to be the name that is attached to the author of this work, Satyricon, the one whose fragments you either have read or are about to read. We actually are not certain whether this particular author of Petronius is the one in the same. We assume that he is, but we are not, in fact, completely certain. What we can tell about Petronius, whether it is in fact this Petronius Arbiter or some other Petronius, is that he appears to have had a very close relationship with Emperor Nero. We're going to spend a later video talking about the two emperors, Claudius and Nero, who were the fourth and fifth, the final of the Julio-Claudian emperors in the first dynasty of the Roman Empire. We're going to, right now, of course, focus on Petronius himself, the author, and discuss a little bit about Satyricon, and we'll, of course, spend a later video talking about the ramifications of this work in itself. But it's important to understand here that we don't exactly know whether Petronius Arbiter is, in fact, the correct name for this author, that there is, in fact, a politician referred to with this name, and we can't be sure exactly whether the politician and the author are the same. Now, what is known about Petronius, we'll go with the assumption that it is in fact the same person, is that Petronius, as we said, had a close relationship with Nero, and in fact was one of several tutors that Nero had together with his mother in order to be able to first accede into the Principate after the death of Claudius, and then ultimately become emperor himself and be able to conduct himself reasonably satisfactorily in the position of emperor, at least for the first several years of his Principate. So Petronius, therefore, probably operated quite frequently within the the entourage of Nero. But things did not go well for Petronius eventually. When Nero became really manic in the mid-60s AD, Nero began imagining everybody around him to be involved in some type of mass conspiracy to assassinate him or overthrow him or do some other kind of bodily or other kind of harm to him. Eventually, Nero started forcing either real or perceived enemies to commit suicide. And our good friend Petronius here was one of those victims who eventually was compelled to commit suicide in a conspiracy plot accusation. We're not sure whether he actually was involved with it, in AD 66, which was 2 years before Nero's own death in AD 68, as we'll talk about in a future video. So apparently Petronius was a rather hedonistic, lazy type. He appears to have been involved with the governorship of the very violent province of Bithynia, which is in the east near the Black Sea. And Petronius himself doesn't seem to have been all that upstanding a citizen, and if the plot of Satyricon gives us any indication of Petronius's tastes, they were not exactly very upstanding, as you can very well tell, even from the relatively few fragments of that work that we have surviving. So he appears to have been something of a ne'er-do-well, and apparently the rather profligate lifestyle that he may possibly have led, if in fact it is reflected in the work that he wrote, apparently eventually was going to cost him. So besides these rather fragmentary aspects of his life and the work that is attributed to him, we unfortunately do not know very much else about this particular author. Now, Satyricon itself is a fragmentary work, as we said. It was originally 20 books long. And it is an example, first of all, of a novel. It's our first novel in this course. And second, it is an example of what's referred to as Menippean satire, something else that we'll discuss in the later video. Menippean satire is prosometric, meaning that it combines mostly prose text, but with poetry inserted within it. Also, this type of novel illustrates a common feature of ancient novels, both Greek and Roman, during which some particular character along the way will narrate another story nested within the original story. And so, although, again, we have to pick and feel our way through the fragments, we could tell that many of the stories that must have been within the general narrative of Satyricon, this rather wild adventure of Encolpius and his friends and enemies, Agamemnon and Gaiton and the others, was probably interlaid with many side stories along the way. So the main story, the narrative you are able to read, the dinner party of Trimalchio, is presumably one of the side stories. It's essentially a step in the rather crazy journey that Encolpius has undertaken. And there's, of course, a lot told about the banquet itself. That's essentially a step aside or a digression from the main narrative. And eventually, when the characters escape from the dinner party at the end, when it goes totally manic, then the main narrative of their own misadventure continues. So, as we say, there are 20 books altogether, and only about 3 books survive to us in fragmentary form with particular episodes. Notable episodes include the dinner party to Trimalchio, the hymn to the fall of Troy, and the story of the widow of Ephesus, a very famous satiric story about the perfectly chaste wife of a deceased husband. This is, in fact, one of those nested stories we discussed that is told by a passenger aboard a ship on which our misdeed characters have boarded passage. So Satyricon then, whose name in Greek means something like Songs of the Satyrs, isn't really, therefore, a set piece with a set plot. It's more accurate to say that the plot itself is, in fact, quite contorted, and there isn't very much that we can really discern from exactly what was going along, aside from a few general outlines of it based on later descriptions of the work and from what we can garner from the fragments themselves. So apparently what's happened in this work has to do with the main character, Encolpius. Encolpius appears to have angered the nature/sex god Priapus, and therefore is being persecuted by him. So we gather that somewhere in the early books that are now lost to us, Encolpius was stricken impotent by Priapus. This means that Encolpius has the same relationship with Priapus as Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey, has with his arch nemesis Poseidon, and Aeneas, similarly in Virgil's Aeneid, has with his arch nemesis the goddess Juno. So now we have Encolpius, who is being pursued by Priapus for some kind of presumably sex-related crime carried out against Priapus. Now, Encolpius has a young boy in his amorous reach. And it appears that much of the misadventure that he's undertaking while he's trying to find a cure for his impotence has to do with trying to keep Gaiton away from others who might want to steal him. So it appears that there is something about a brothel and a stolen garment that comes near the beginning of the fragments. Then eventually, when they're being pursued by someone who wants to get the stolen item back, probably with murderous intent, it is for that reason that they end up hiding out at the dinner party, and they stay for as long as they can stand it until eventually things, as we say, get totally crazy with the false funeral at the end and the fire brigade showing up trying to put out a fire that's not actually there, and so forth. Eventually, the characters in question just simply have to leave, and they get back on their way, and life continues as bizarrely and crazily as it ever is. So, the main narrative, therefore, is essentially a contorted, very disjointed plot with all these sidesteps and additional stories told into it. In reality, most of the works that we have from the ancient world were probably composed much like this. Virgil's Aeneid does appear to have been distinguished by the poet's effort to compose the work from start to finish. When you go back to much earlier works, especially Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and probably also the tragedies and comedies to a lesser extent. Many times the works were composed piecemeal and only later put together in order to form the texts as we later have them. And we can't always be sure whether the texts as we eventually did receive them in fact reflect accurately the original texts as were composed by those authors. Whereas Virgil's Aeneid does seem to have been a closely composed work from start to finish, because we do have ancient testimony about public readings that he did with Aeneid, and therefore we could track through the process that the work made. Even as such, though, there are signs of incompleteness, and so as we talked about previously with Virgil, it doesn't appear that he finished the work and he actually wanted the work burned. He apparently was very displeased with it. So whether this work was ever finished, of course, is anybody's guess. It doesn't appear to have been an especially satisfying work, and eventually, as we say, it fell into ruin, and only isolated fragments were eventually recovered from it. It does have quite a few neat stories in it, however. One of the neatest parts of it has to do with the central section in the banquet of Trimalchio, in which Trimalchio, in order to stop a fight that's going on, suddenly, as a distraction, turns to a friend of his and says, "Why don't you tell that neat story that happened to you?" And it turns out to be a story about a werewolf. And this is, in fact, one of the few occurrences of ghosts that we have in the ancient world. We do have a ghost famously in Aeschylus's Persians, and of course we have the ghost of Aeneas' father, Anchises, in Virgil's Aeneid, and there's also a very prominent ghost scene in one of the tragedies of Seneca. But a monster like a werewolf is a somewhat unusual being to locate within the pages of any Greek or Roman work. So to find that here is quite remarkable. And then Trimalchio can never be outdone by any one of his guests, so as soon as his friend Nicaros tells the story of the werewolf, Trimalchio, of course, turns around immediately and says, "Well, you know what? I got a really good story, too." And he tells a story about a straw dummy that was created because a particular very sick boy was cursed by witches. and the corpse of the boy was eventually turned into a straw dummy, essentially. And so both stories are in fact quite frightening, and it's clear from the reaction of Encolpius, the narrator, that the audience was pretty frightened by both of them. We're going to talk a little bit later in the course about magic. Both the Greeks and the Romans appear to have taken magic, superstition, and the nefarious arts of witchcraft and other associated forms of sorcery, wizardry, whatever, relatively seriously. That's not to say that they believed in it deeply. They imagined it as being susceptible to quackery, chicanery, and such. But they do appear to have taken seriously the idea of the dark arts, essentially. And so some of that finds its way in the pages of Satyricon, and if one knows where to look, one can find that. So Petronius, therefore, is showing us Roman myth in a different form. When you have Trimalchio spitting out little piecemeal stories about the Trojan War, trying to show off his knowledge of Greek literature quite imperfectly, we could tell that Greek and Roman literature is out there, but it's not very well understood by the masses. And Trimalchio is a very boastful, vain freedman who has become super, super rich, and he wants to show off in front of all of his guests. The guests are all compelled to be there because they themselves are freedmen. They are clients of Trimalchio, who is their patron. And as such, as we've talked about in a previous video, the patron has the clients all basically under his grasp. The clients owe something to the patron for previous services rendered to them. And so if there's going to be a dinner party featuring, of course, him as the guest of honor, so to speak, everybody has to duly come and pay their appropriate respects by showing up at that party, even though very likely they would much, much rather be somewhere else at that time. So Trimalchio's dinner party, therefore, is a really great additional view we have into some of the not so great aspects of Roman society under the empire. Once again, as is always the case with Roman history, we see a very sharp divide between super, super wealthy, not so wealthy. But in this case, we do see an example of how a freedman, in fact, was able to amass enormous wealth and be able to, in a business-like way, with real estate and deals and such, to eventually become enormously prosperous, probably at the expense of quite a few other people, and obviously way above what most average people were able to do. And that's reflected in a lot of those side conversations that we hear in the middle of the banquet, especially when Trimalchio goes off to the bathroom, to indicate that there was a great deal of private unrest in Roman society, just like most societies, where you've got a few wealthy people up at the top and a lot of poor scavengers down below. So, regardless of whatever we know about Petronius or his relationship with Nero, it is clear that Petronius had a pretty saucy view of Roman society, definitely not complimentary. Truthfully, the Emperor Nero himself, as we'll talk about when we get to Nero, reflects some of the extremes and excesses and lavishness and rather neglectful and obnoxious luxuriousness that characterizes a lot of the Roman aristocracy in this time period, and also the nobility with all these businessmen, the equites, who are able to make their way up the ranks with merchantry and business and such. It just increases the divide, the tension in Roman society. Surprisingly, though, unlike in the Republic, where those tensions create quite a bit of turmoil from time to time, especially the Gracchi brother period, as we talked about in previous videos. In this period, it appears that with the Principate now well established, although the discontent obviously remains, it doesn't appear to have spilled out to the surface to create any noticeable unrest specifically in Roman society. So the Roman Empire, despite its pretty evident weaknesses, as we see from this work, was able to continue on pretty well. But when you see the conversations, you see all the dialogue, you can see that not everybody is very happy. This is also, by the way, one of the few examples we have of what's referred to as vulgar Latin, which is to say Latin that's spoken by the commoners as opposed to very well-educated, we could say almost elite type authors like Cicero, for instance. And so we have some words, some dialect that's almost like Cockney in British society. And it's a really fascinating insight into some of the lesser, not so wonderful aspects of Roman society to see how this is. And so we can be grateful to the author Petronius for showing this to us. And once again, we can see, therefore, that Roman myth, although it has obviously an aggrandizing effect of the Roman state, also does itself reflect some of the weaknesses in Roman society. And it's pretty clear that whatever Roman myth wants to present to us as the grandeur of Rome, not everybody was totally sold on the illusion. Okay, so that takes care of Petronius, and in our next video, immediately after this one, we will turn to the other author, Seneca, his philosophy, and his pillorying of Emperor Claudius in the work Apocalyptosis. We'll see you in the next video.